Hello, friends. This is Eli from Mystic Circuits. I recently played a live show. It had been the first time in a while that I'd done it, and I was feeling pretty good about how everything came together. I tried a lot of newer sort of techniques that I've been developing recently into the setup, and I tried to approach things in a slightly different way that I normally do. And so I was thinking, before I take everything apart, because I have a larger case that I normally put all of my modules into. So before I put all of my modules back into my larger case, I thought I would go through my case and show a little bit of how I approach live performance with my own modules. As you can see, I'm using a fair number of my own modules. I wanted to fit in Anna into this patch, but I ended up going with like 4 pretty big drum modules, and I just ended up prioritizing other stuff. But yeah, hypothetically, I use all of my own modules in my own performances, and I'm going to go over some approaches that I use with other people's modules as well. As you can see, I have rings and beads over here doing your sort of stereotypical rings into clouds setup, but I have a couple of pretty interesting approaches that I haven't heard of other people doing, so I figure I would share that. I think that even though it is a sort of like cliche rings into clouds at this point, or rings into beads nowadays, I think that there's a reason for that, and that there's actually a lot of unexplored territory with the combination of the two modules, and you might see that a little bit in my own setup. So one of the things that I tried to do, this is like a sort of alternate panel for IDUM. I ended up using kind of a weird knob for it, so it's not quite as visible, but it was just easier to take out of my rack. I really like the panel art, but it's just don't be confused by the fact that IDUM looks a little bit different this time. For what it's worth, this very nice fellow sells these panels in black with artwork that I honestly think is way better than my artwork. So if you want to go check out Encurrence, Nkurence, I believe his shop is on Etsy. But you can find, if you just Google Encurrence Euro Rack, you should be able to find all of his panels. He does repanels for a lot of really interesting stuff with artwork, again, that I think is very compelling. So happy to support him. You'll see here that I have my IDUM set up, and you might think I have my IDUM hooked up to these 4 drum modules, right? And honestly, in a lot of cases, I do end up just taking 4 drum sounds and running them into running, my trigger sequencer. I almost always start my performance with the performer, the westlicht performer. It's a module that a lot of people are fans of, but it's not as popular as it might be if it was like commercially available, just because the designer open sourced all the files and then sourced it under a non-commercial license, which basically means like, you're only supposed to sell a certain number a year or something like that. We'll see how long it takes somebody to disrespect the license, but it's a fantastic sequencer. And one of the nice things about it is that you can actually have your launchpad. I have my launchpad hooked up to the sequencer. I couldn't get everything in the shot, but I'll push some buttons on the launchpad and you'll see that red light is selecting the 8 different channels, right? So, and then I'm able to like go through different menus and stuff. Hypothetically, I think I need to go into a menu first and then it will let me switch menus. So if I do like this, you could see I'm going between the different menus on the screen, doing all of that on the launchpad. I usually just use this for trigger sequencing, which is a sort of a waste of its potential. But it's fantastic for it. And I just, I appreciate having something with 8 triggers and a screen that helps me set it all up in the launchpad. It makes my workflow a lot faster. And so I decided this time that I wasn't going to patch my modules through IDUM. I wanted all of my rhythmic variation to be done by using the launchpad and by having longer sequences. So whereas maybe sometimes I would have a 16-step sequence and then add variations through IDUM, I wanted to have more 64-step sequences where I would have a similar sort of pattern but with slight variations throughout it, so it felt like there was some diversity to the patterns. And then I ended up using the sample drum as one of the channels. So the bottom channel of the sample drum is being driven through IDUM just because it's doing hi-hats, and I wanted to have a little bit more of a way to modulate the sound. I have it selecting samples. In fact, here I can go to the perform page. You can see the samples are changing up there. I have both channels sort of doing separate tasks. I have all of my drums mixed through attenuators, just because usually if I'm muting and unmuting drums, I'm not really doing it as much on 3D VCA. I'm just using the drums together. I'm going to go ahead and turn the sound on. So you can hear we have drums coming through. Usually if I'm going to mute or unmute a drum, I'm going to do it from the trigger side. So I can turn off all the triggers with the perform button, which will let you mute and do fills and stuff like that. And you can do that through the iPad or the launchpad, obviously, as well. But I wanted to be able to set the relative volume in a sort of static way. So if I make the bass drum a little bit louder, you can see on here, I can turn the attenuator, snare gets louder, bass drum kind of ends up taking over things if you let it. So I just kind of pulled back on all of the drums a little bit. And another reason that I like this approach, I use the quad drum a lot, where all four of these drums would basically be like the same size as these two modules, right? So it's way more compact. There's a lot of really fantastic under the hood options. Like it has a compressor built in that sounds pretty nice. It lets you do CV over like the preset for all four drums at a time. It does some really deep stuff, but I wanted to try an approach where there was nothing really hidden behind the menus. Even on the sample drum where there's a bunch of menus, I set up the performer page so that like I can change the pitch of the hi-hat and then change the decay, just for some, basic control. And then obviously also I have IDUM letting me do like rolls with the hi-hat and that sort of thing. But the rest of the drums are all going through normally, right? So that means that all of my rhythmic variation for these drums is being done on the launchpad. And one of the things about that is that I'm a big sucker for breaks, right? So usually on the launchpad, I'm not really doing very much with the snare. I want the snare to be nice. Right now, Plaits is doing my snare. I actually quite like the snare on Plaits. It's not like super punchy, but you can get a lot of really nice, like kind of subdued snare sounds on it. Obviously, something a little more bongo-y like that, you add back in the noise. It definitely feels more like a sort of synthesized snare than like a realistic one, but I quite like that. And then I have Plaits doing a steady snare, right? And then I have Grackle doing a little bit of like an FM percussion voice. Grackle's an upcoming phase modulation oscillator that has a lot of really kind of granular control and good modulation options. And it also has a built-in envelope, which you can use to get pretty snappy, right? So it definitely can sort of take over because there's just so many harmonics when you're doing this sort of thing, right? But if you find a sound you like and then you make it really snappy, it adds some really interesting like percussive elements to a drum patch like this. And I would say too, like with an FM percussion voice, I find that a lot of modular music kind of suffers from a little bit. The percussion is often entirely based on FM, and I have a feeling that that's partially due to the success of the Bassimilis Iteritas, which is definitely not a knock on that module, right? There's a reason it's so popular, but I think that module made it so easy for people to send a bunch of modulation in and get a bunch of different voices out of the same drum using all of these FM sounds, that then people started to look at the percussive options out there and be like, oh, what people want out of percussion is FM. And I feel like less is more with this kind of sound, right? So even sometimes when I'll make the envelope a little bit longer, I'm doing it with really sparse patterns. It's not like, here, I'll just give you a comparison, right? I'm also modulating the decay on it, right? You hear how quickly that kind of takes over everything? So I'm just doing a little bit of like a driving sort of sound to it, right? So usually with a break, you want to have a couple of rhythmic elements that stayed exactly the same. So like plaits doing the snare on the offbeats. Normally if I was running that into IDUM, it would be giving us rolls and other patterns and stuff like that. I wanted to try and keep that consistent while having a lot of the rhythmic variation come from the bass drum by doing 64-step patterns on the bass drum. And one of the cool things with the launchpad is that I can set a pattern up. I can see the full, here, I'll just shove it. It's kind of hard because I have to reach around my mic. I also know at some point my camera's going to turn off. I don't normally do long takes like this, but okay. So this is like your standard break. You want on the 1 and on the offbeat of the 3, right? So now if I was just to do something like this lets you set the last step in the pattern. Now we have a 64-step pattern, right? I can hypothetically set everything up ahead of time over here, right? So let's add in some little flourishes in this area where there's a lot of emptiness, right? Right? We don't want to do too much because, especially with the ultrakick, which if you don't already know, this thing sounds incredible. And sometimes you want to be able to really crank the parameters on the ultrakick, right? So now, give it a little bit more oomph, you know? If I had a ton of bass drum hits all over there, it might get a little boring, right? Right, this sort of thing. I think that you're getting a decent idea of the sort of basis for the percussive patch. I can now sort of tweak out on the hi-hat, and even with it giving me just a tiny bit of variation, if I mess with the parameters, it's just like adding a little bit of extra spice on top. It's not necessarily the driving force behind this patch. In fact, I could take the grackle and have it doing our standard like disco beat hi-hat. Which I'm sure Naomi would hate if she's watching this. But you can get some pretty interesting hi-hat stuff out of it. I'm going to make it just slightly different. I think this hi-hat pattern has a lot more movement, even though it's not really changing very much at all, right? And yeah, like I said, if you get it with a lot of harmonics and just make a little plinky thing out of it, and then every once in a while, CV comes and opens up the envelope, gives a lot of interesting rhythmic variation, right? So I'm gonna even take out this hi-hat, which is the one which is going through IDUM, so that you can hear the part of the rhythm that has no influence from IDUM, right? You can hear, even though the snare and the hi-hat are both doing a 16-step sequence, right? They're doing the exact same thing every time. In fact, the hi-hat repeats both of these repeat every 8 steps, right? Like within every measure, they're exactly the same. Because we have a little bit of modulation on the hi-hat and the bass drum pattern has a 64-step sequence, even though that's repeating every time, right? I haven't changed it at all since I did that original demonstration. It lets us, it lets the overall pattern seem like it has a lot more variety than it actually does. Basically, everybody knows rings into clouds, rings into beads. Very similar idea. You have your physical modeling string synthesizer doing something similar to Car plus Strong, or doing Car plus Strong. You know, variations on Car plus Strong. Going into your granular delay recording effect. As the reverb built in, you can see I have it cranked all the way up, but not for the reasons that you think. And you know, you put your rings into your beads and just send it to your output, and everything's hunky dory because you know, it's all smeared and pretty, and it makes everything pretty for you. And you know, it's also in stereo. You automatically get a stereo signal out of it, right? So what I like to do a little bit differently is I take one side of rings. I do have both channels of rings patched into beads, but I split one of them off to be able to hear it directly. And then I take both channels of beads. I take one channel and I send it to our final output, and then I take the other channel, I plug it back into rings, right? And what that does is it gives us a voice where the previous audio that we've made earlier in the patch is actually being re-resonated into rings in a way that gives you a lot of control over the exciter sound. And if I was to go ahead and turn up my filter, oh, right, they're going into 3D VCA so I can crossfade more easily. So, just to illustrate, I'm gonna take this out, right? Pretty standard rings sound. I mean, obviously, we're doing it with the maximum number of polyphony, so it has multiple notes happening. And I'm going to take out all the randomness. You might have noticed that IDUM is messing with our parameters, right? So that's how rings sounds if we listen to beads. I have the wetness almost all the way up and the reverb up as well. I usually don't crank the reverb all the way because it kind of changes some of the setting. I like that one reverb knob changes a lot of settings about the reverb at once. And then I have a little bit of feedback in there. I also have the same clock. Basically, our main clock out is clocking rings here. And it's also seeding beads because I want to be able to use beads as a clock, as a tempo synced delay, which it has the option to do. And the reason for that is because I'm not actually using the exciter input to give rings a rhythm. I'm using it to quantize the volt per octave inputs, because otherwise you get kind of a burst of a bunch of volt per octaves, it tries to make all of them into notes, and also just to ensure that some kind of exciter is going into the feedback loop, because sometimes the feedback loop, if there's enough silence in it, it's hard to start it back up again. And just to show you again what the difference in sound is, I'm going to go ahead and take the output from beats and plug it back into the resonator input. That sounds quite a bit different, doesn't it? And you might notice, in fact, I'm going to turn off the beads. We're only hearing the output of rings now, right? If I was to do something like this, you can hear the feedback kind of explodes in this rhythmic way, depending on the position of the density knob, right? When the density's bipolar, so at noon it doesn't give you any audio output. You can hear there like my feedback was going away, right? That's why it's nice to have a couple of novel ways to inject feedback into it. I usually like to turn up the resonance on a feedback patch like this because it helps prevent the feedback from completely disappearing even when audio goes away a little bit, because it extends the tail of whatever audio you have going through it. But if I turn it all the way down, it actually does change the character of the feedback quite a bit. You can hear with the density all the way up. Again, this density is tempo synced, so if I turn this up a little bit, it'll start to overlap more. I have it on like the kind of softer window setting, so let's change it back to a square. The square pretty much allows for your feedback to happen in a more unfiltered way. And then this will also, brightness is a low pass filter on the exciter input. So turning this all the way up will allow your feedback to come through, only being filtered by the actual Carpla Strong algorithm. Whereas this will sort of like reduce the overall, like the brightness. Obviously, that's the name of the knob, but it reduces the brightness of the overall effect, right? But it also sort of reduces the influence of the feedback on rings, right? Because if you're doing this, more of the audio from beats is able to go through into the resonator on rings, right? I've found that usually having a low, and in fact, I'm going to take out the freeze just because freeze is doing, sorry, it's hard because I'm like looking at this screen too. So freeze is sort of doing what you'd expect. It makes it so that we're able to take some piece of the historical audio and feed it back into the resonator in a way that creates some interesting polyphony. But just for the sake of this, we'll go ahead and turn that off. In fact, I could just take out seed too, so you can see what the raw sort of feedback sounds like, right? So taking the time setting, obviously I have randomness turned down as much as possible. Turning the time setting down is going to make it so that the delay value is really short, right? And so you're going to get a lot of these kind of higher whistling sounds, especially if I make the size setting kind of short. Having trouble replicating the effect, but I guess just to say the time value, especially when you're unquantized, because running a clock into seed will quantize your time to the clock value, and I'm going to go ahead and do that again, but using shorter time values will make it so that more recent polyphonic note data is fed back into rings, whereas using a longer one will make it so that something further in the past is being fed in, so it's more likely to be another note. In fact, I could change this back to a monophonic patch. And if we were to listen to the output from beads, oh, right, I turned it off. You can hear that it's sort of like playing a previous version of the note information, whereas if I made the time really close, they kind of end up synchronizing. Oh, this is what I was trying to get at. This is like comb filtering because it's going fast enough, right? But if I do something maybe closer to here, you can hear it sounds more like a traditional delay, right? If you get somewhere in between, it'll start to sound a little bit more like a chorus. Like if you can get it up to a point that's not quite those really fast ones. I'm going to turn the feedback down a little bit. Turn the density up. There we go. You can see it's kind of like repeating what just happened. Whereas something more like this, maybe a little lower density, is going to give you something further in the past. While we're on this, I'm going to show you one last little trick, which obviously you turn the pitch all the way up, it gives you a really nice bloom. If you do it like this, so now we're just hearing the effect going through rings. You can hear it has kind of a big effect on how rings is sounding by itself even. Oh, I confused it. If you ever want the effect from beads to come through rings more, just turn the dampener down, because the dampener is basically just feeding the output of rings straight back into its input so that it has a longer, I believe that's how it works anyways, it has a longer sort of like tail, but it also sort of reinforces the note that the model is playing, right? So it's like kind of an interesting effect, you know. I like the nonlinear mode's my favorite mode, and it gets really like wonky, like quickly. But if you add just a little bit of nonlinearity, like kind of to ear, in a way where it doesn't sound out of tune, because like you can hear here, it doesn't sound like it's in tune anymore, right? If you do something around here, it makes it sound a lot more like a real instrument. Like obviously it still sounds quite synthetic, but it kind of has the qualities of a real instrument, right? I also really like to crank this one, the position knob, all the way out here. It gives you some really weird kind of like fret noise almost, or kind of like a little bit of like wobbly ringing once it gets to the edge of the parameter. But yeah, so I like running the shimmer in. I usually, again, do it with 4 notes. And in this mode, it ends up sort of splitting the two up differently. I haven't even gotten to the note sequencing yet. And one thing to note, before we get there, we're really close. You know, all of this is all well and good, but Rhythmically, this patch is quite boring. That's because I'm just driving it from the clock, as I said earlier. The reason for this is that I have both my rings and my beads going through the natural gate, as you might have noticed. So if I turn open down, basically closing the VCA, you can hear we got all these really nice little plinks, right? And because it's a low-pass filter, the more sort of like bright content that we can feed into it, the more interesting that the results are going to be. So if I was to maybe turn IDUM back on, you can hear that we get some interesting behavior out of this. Now, I only have the IDUM driving the natural gate channel that is gating rings. The other channel I sometimes will leave up. I keep forgetting that I did the crossfade up here, right? So I'll sometimes leave it up, and then you get a sort of like polyphonic re-scrambling of whatever's going on the other channel, right? Especially with the shimmer effect. You get some pretty versions of whatever's going on the other channel, but the notes don't exactly link up, right? Because we're going through this delay, right? If I wanted to maybe change the wet dry, sometimes a little bit more of the input will come through to the output, but especially for feedback, I'll do this sometimes to restart the feedback, but especially for feedback purposes, I like leaving it fully wet so that I'm able to control entirely what you're hearing, right? So as I said before, the ambient channel is not going through IDUM, and that's partially because I wanted to be able to make it really sparse, right? So you have this ambience happening all the time. Yeah, sure, it's pretty, but like, I can do that with the open slider. What I would prefer is to make it like just almost like a chord stab. So what I do is I turn this down, I'm going to turn this down, and then I just have a longer decay coming directly from the performer, right? So I only have one, you can see here, this is my pattern. I only have the one step on, right? I'm going to turn this up a little bit. As you can see, I'm mixing the natural gates together with 3D VCA, as well as the drums are all going into the sum inputs through the attenuators, just because I wanted all of this to occupy one channel. So 3D VCA makes it so that you can still hear, like, the natural gate doesn't completely shut up when it's totally closed, which is fine, it's not supposed to, but this one makes it so I can really easily isolate each sound, right? And also set the relative volume between them. So now I'll go ahead and turn up the decay for this again. We get a little bit more of the Seinfeld bass. And then you can hear the polyphonic sort of chord thing only happens like once per pattern, even if the rest of it is going nuts, right? And now you might have noticed I've got these trees up here with IDUM, right? And you'll notice as well that if I run IDUM faster, this tree leaves combo is also going faster, right? The reason for this is that I'm actually driving tree with a clock that's going through one of tree's main channels, because I wanted to have, obviously you can drive it with the clock output, but all that really does is the pausing and skipping and stuff. I wanted to be able to do some more experimental sort of sequencing, which I'm going to focus on my Seinfeld bass. Right, so now I'm doing a bouncing ball on this sequence. I'm going to take out the taking out the transpose, which is coming from this second sequencer. This second sequencer is being driven by the clock output, right? So you can see when I engage the effect, it'll pause sometimes, right? And this is a new prototype for tree. The steps are mismatched. I apologize if that's confusing, but it is just going in a line. It's just each step is swapped. If I turn this all the way down, you can see it's just counting through, and then this is going once or twice. Hold on. Okay, so this is the pattern that I have going in for the clock, right? It makes it so that it changes whenever we get a snare, right? But also I can have it go like a little bit off from the rest of the pattern, so. Or I can have it, obviously if you have an even number of steps, it's going to repeat itself every 4 bars, right? Because it's going slower, it makes it so that it takes a longer amount of time. But watch what happens if I add in an odd number of steps. See that it actually takes quite a bit longer to go back to our original sequence like this, right? So using an actual step sequencer to drive this other sequencer lets me kind of decide how much of a variation I want, especially when I have just a normal 8-step sequence going completely in line with the rest of the sequence. I'm going to add some more steps in just so that we can hear a little bit more of what's going on. It's nice to have like a little bit of openness, but sometimes you want it to be plinky, sometimes you want it to ring out a little more, right? So you can hear now it's repeating itself, just not very quickly, right? If I do something like this, it's literally a 4-bar loop that's being generated through the combination of these 2 tree leaves. For me, the perfect setup is 2 trees, 4 leaves, right? But if I need to have some algorithmic sequencing, 2 trees and 2 leaves is fine. I've had in my head like ideas for a sequencer that would basically just be a consolidated version of that, but I'm trying to get tree out again first. We'll see how that goes. But basically, one of the things that lets me add variation into the actual sequence is adding IDUM clock manipulation stuff, not the trigger manipulation stuff into the actual pattern. So you can see here, I'm not just doing bouncing balls on the actual natural gate. I'm also doing it on the sequencer that's driving the rings that the natural gate's going through. So again, I'm going to take out the transposition just to make it even easier to tell what's going on. This is probably the most experimental version of this. But it yields some pretty interesting results. You can hear, especially with the break in the background, right? We're doing some pretty strange rhythmic stuff, but it all seems like it's fitting into our larger structure. I'll take the drum beat out just as an example. One of the nice things about the bouncing ball mode is at these low settings, close to noon, you get these weird kind of like swung rhythms that aren't, they're just the ball bouncing very slowly. But if you kind of search for a sweet spot, you can get some really nice, like natural, kind of human sounding rhythms. I'm going to add back in. sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? So I'm going to add back in the beads, ambience sort of thing, just so you can hear what that sounds like. So you can hear, even though we just have one oscillator, we're getting a sort of fake polyphonic patch out of all of this, right? And one of my favorite things about this is that I don't have to worry about knocking a damn tuning knob in the middle of my performance and then having to redo everything. This is gonna, you know, maybe sound a little seasick, but check this out. Look at that, it's all still in tune, right? It's even doing the same scale that it was doing because I have the quantizer set up externally, right? So, you know, that isn't usually a performance thing. I don't generally mess with the tuning that much in the middle of my set, just because it's kind of hard to aim for like a tuning that would sound nice on the side. But it's nice to know that, like, if I do change the knob, it really only took a couple of seconds for everything else to fall back in tune, right? I'm not normally doing the bouncing ball for everything. Ratchet is usually the easiest way to keep everything in time. And for this performance, I'm doing, let's see, I think I'm doing odd ratchets because I want to be able to do triplets sometimes as well. But yeah, you can see sort of like the combination of these two tree leaves gives us like a lot of interesting algorithmic sorts of note compositions without necessarily having to sit there and think about it. I hate thinking, you know me. So, like, you know, if I wanna, I'm really a lot more partial to the sort of like analog slider style of recomposition, just feeling it out. Normally I'll take out the influence of IDUM and sort of get myself to a point where I'm like bringing things closer to zero, and then maybe I'll turn a couple of these sliders that transpose things up. Or, you know, one of the nice things about having these transpose inputs is now this leaves is completely taken out of the loop, right? And I'm able to just focus on this particular part of the sequence because this one's going to be moving a lot faster usually. Might turn up the filter on this one. For what it's worth, I'm normally taking all of these other outputs and running them into various CV inputs throughout the performance. So, like, for example, gosh, I kind of hate these right angle plugs. You know, I only have so big of a lid, so I kind of have to use them. And also for filming, they're great. But, you know, imagine plugging into this input right now, right? So I'm going to go ahead and modulate. In fact, I'll do this one just so that we don't have to change. Modulate the decay. Higher notes have a longer decay, at least in the middle of the sequence. I'm gonna maybe even just turn this up. This is what the clock, what do you call it? The clocked delay sounds like. Go ahead and plug into freeze again. But you can hear it's an 8-step sequence. It's not really changing that much. Sure, we can use IDUM and sort of scramble the order things, but it'll go back to that. Now, if I just turn up a couple of these sliders, Something to note as well is that the clock output from IDUM is actually driving the seed input and the strum on rings. So if I start to mess with the clock output, for example, by using a longer length so that it's skipping clocks, it'll actually also change the clock tempo speed on beats, which will give us more interesting sort of rhythmic variation, right? Like, I'm gonna completely go to beats now. Oh, always doing that. Yeah, this is with no reverb, full wetness. I might even just do it with the downwards envelope so that we can hear the rhythm of what beats is actually doing to our input, right? For this sort of patch, I sometimes like to take out a little bit of the low end. Where'd I lose you? We're doing the beats setup for re-scrambling our input, but we're doing it as a clock multiplied delay now. Having longer settings for the time, especially when the clock ends up speeding back up again, because I'm running this at 150 BPM. Having a longer setting for the time makes it so that you'll get more similar sort of behavior to the input, especially because now I'm like randomly freezing our buffer. If you do it like this, so this is like minimum time settings, you're gonna get a lot more kind of like buzzy comb filter kind of results when things speed up. With the enveloped audio, I'm probably gonna turn up the reverb a little bit. Couple of these unused outputs, sort of start modulating stuff around your patch. I like to do either the brightness or dampness on rings a lot because it helps kind of almost like fake velocity for it. Here on these middle steps where brightness is getting modulated, it becomes a lot more active, you know, whereas on the other steps it's a lot more subdued, especially if you do something like this. I really like running rings with like low brightness, long dampening, long decay. Sounds pretty nice, right? There is a third element to this patch that I could talk about in depth, but honestly, I've been recording for almost an hour now, and I think I'm ready to stop listening to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you real fast. I have a bunch of music loaded up on my sample drum. Within the context of the other music, it just adds a little bit of a rhythmic variation, or like a percussive element. You know, there's a vocal sample in there. It's also being sequenced from here. I have both the sample and the start point sampled in there, but the hold is really low, so it's just a little guy. And then as the hold gets longer, I have more of the original music coming in. And then with just this, I have this really obnoxious sound collage that is an idea I've been experimenting with recently. I don't know how much I'm ready to say about it. I mean, the idea is obviously just that I'm taking other people's music and making my own music out of it. I will say that one of the reasons I like it is because I have some songs that I listen to over and over and over and over and over again. This makes it so that I can just take my favorite parts of all of those songs and make music out of them. The other reason I like it is because it really kind of like poses a lot of questions about ownership and who the artist is. It's like, sure, I mean, like, this patch is just me randomly shoving CV into it, but if I was to spend some time actually crafting the music, I think something pretty compelling can come out of it. I have it set up so that the samples that are earlier in the folder are all almost entirely like more electronic, right? And again, Leaves is sequencing both the sample number and the start point. I just didn't have time to slice it correctly. There's some wonky ways that the sample drum handles slicing, where it'll only play through the slice, it won't play through the rest of the sample. So I have to sort of figure out a way to do that. But if you go further out, it gets into more acoustic and sort of like, you know, less electronic music. So I have my klezmer mixed with my Shirley Collins mixed with my I forget, some old ska music and oval, some Indian music, right? Like, none of these are in the same scale or tempo, but if you recall them rhythmically, it sort of forces them all to exist within the same context. So, I don't know. It's an idea I'm playing around with. I'm not sure I've nailed the execution, but I've had a couple moments with it where I felt like I got close to what I'm going for, and it was like, yeah, but the rest of the time, it's just annoying enough for people to pretend that they like it.
I think
Obviously, it usually sort of focuses on one sample, which is whatever your sample 0 is, depending on the position of this knob. But, yeah. I don't know. Eventually, I think I'll figure out this style of sort of sound collage music. But for now, I won't torture your ears with it anymore. Gosh, this was a really long recording session. I hope that some of it was helpful to y'all. I hope that some of it was even interesting to y'all. And yeah, if you have any questions, I can probably answer them in the comments. You know, if I'm not very protective over this kind of stuff. You know, I feel like especially when it comes to rings and beads, I might even do another video fully focused on that combination, because I do think that there's a lot of unexplored territory there that yes, a lot of people use it just to make very similar sounding ambient music, partially because it sounds so good. But you know, I think that there's a lot of stuff you can do besides just ambient music with that combination. There's a reason that it's so prevalent and that Mutable Instruments has such a, you know, esteemed reputation. So again, thank you for watching. I hope you're having a lovely day, staying safe out there. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.